Bang. I'm a bit devastated. I just recorded this and I didn't save it properly. So, look, it's never as good the second time, is it really? Anyway, I've had a lot of, I figured I'm pretty like in a bouncy mood this morning, so it'd be a good opportunity to cover a couple of questions around how you teach with the bubble action, because I'm working with a lot of new teachers at the moment and who don't, or where explicit teaching is not a part of their teaching routine. And so this, I guess, a simple demonstration of where it sits has been really important for me to get my head around, to help those new teachers get their head around that. You make a lot of assumptions as a teacher that you know because you know how to do stuff, but excuse the pun, but you really need to be really explicit in how you teach teachers to teach. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to go on and talk about explicit teaching with the bubble action. And it's a 3-step process. I'll move the little picture down there, so that's good. And there it is. First, you have a very simple, and I'll keep it very simple, you have an introduction of concepts. That might be a text page. It might be a poem. It might be an extract from a Frankenstein book, which you're going to have a bit later. It might be a scene from Romeo and Juliet, whatever the case may be. And you introduce that, and you talk about it, and you read through it, whatever the case may be. And then the second stage of that is the examination, exploration, and discussion of that. And that's the fun part of teaching, where everyone sits around, you talk about the text, you elicit ideas, you have a discussion. It's very inclusive. There's opportunities for feedback. It's rich, it's deep, it's cognitive, it's all of those things. And it's often the most, in some ways, it's a really enjoyable part of teaching. I wouldn't say it's the most enjoyable part of teaching. I find that the next stage, but for a lot of people, it's what makes teaching English so satisfying. Unfortunately, as it says there, that's where a lot of teaching ends, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It doesn't go on to that process of, okay, we've talked about it, we've thought about it, we've laughed about it, we've cried about it, okay, but we haven't actually written about it, and that's where we need to go with that. Okay, so the explicit guided written outcome, as it says there, is where we take it all back to the board. We do all that stuff. If we're in science, we're dropping eggs off balconies and we're throwing paper planes and we're blowing things up and starting fires and cutting hearts out. You've got to take it back to a written outcome, because you're not going to be assessed on how well you can dissect a heart or throw an aeroplane or drop an egg off a balcony or think or feel about, an English text. It's not enough to feel about it. You've got to write about it. Okay, so anyway. Apologies for my manner of, a wee bit hyperactive. Okay, so for example, here we have example from Frankenstein and the conversation around romanticism and the sublime. So it starts with a simple thing. You draw the student's attention to the bit of text that you want to talk about. Here, this is a very famous part of the text where he goes off into the mountains, and he's heading off, as it says there, to the summit of Montavert, and he reflects upon the tremendous impact that it had upon him, that filled him with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul and allowed it to soar for the obscure world of light and joy. I've got a young man out there running, his hand along the bars. It's really annoying. And that's a really hugely important part of the text, and it's not enough. It's not sufficient enough to say to the kids, okay, go and read the text and go and look for some interesting bits, without being proactive in guiding students' direction towards important parts of the text that they need to talk about. I remember one of the criteria marking in the HSC, it talked about the judicious use of textual material. 9 times out of 10, they're not going to get there on the line, or 7 times out of 10, whatever the case may be. But you really do need to be proactive in taking them and pointing them towards specific parts of the text that are really important to write about. Here, as it says, and I've shamelessly used the scaffold, the teachers might draw attention to this part of the text where Shelley's use of metaphors, celebrating the sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul, recognises the cathartic and restorative nature of the sublime, integral to the Romantic period. Okay, so that's why you'd want to talk about this, because this is a really nice and juicy part of the text. Okay, so moving on, and that might be a poem, whatever the case may be. It might, probably a line in a poem. Okay, so then you go on and you engage with those textual ideas. I can't see myself down there. That's really disconcerting. So I'll move myself up there. And this is the learning and cognition. And this is the really enjoyable part of the text, you know. There we are, this guy here in the picture playing Mr. Charisma, sitting, guiding, you know. You introduce new vocabulary, for example, such as words cathartic, restorative, regenerative. You do the, Lisa Simpson thing, where instead of having one word, you have three. That's always good. You might discuss American transcendentalism and Thoreau and Waldman, stuff like that. Or, as it says there, the concept of biophilia, the idea that humans are genetically predisposed to love nature and need regular contact with it to survive. I mean, the students are going to love that. Who's not going to want to know about biophilia? Maybe for the wrong reasons. Anyway, students should and could browse academic journals. But again, teachers need to be judicious in how they go through that process. I know that there are a lot of schools that just throw a wad of 100 pages of academia at them and go unleash, fella. But you really need to, you need to be proactive and taking them through. It's fantastic for them to, but it's also incredibly onerous for them to read through 100 pages of academic material. And I think there's a lot of time that can be saved and a lot of wisdom that can be taught by directing them towards perhaps some of the better articles there and some of the better parts of articles. Some academic journals are rubbish. Some of them waffle enormously, and we don't want them to replicate that. But some of them are on point, So again, being a teacher, proactive in that process, rather than in a supervisory role, which is all it is if you're just giving that stuff out. And here, like Mr. Charisma on the chair there, the role of the teacher is very much as a facilitator of knowledge, assisting with understanding and ensuring students grasp important concepts. And invariably when I teach, whether it's year 8 or year 12, these kids know the concepts. You talk about them, they're nodding, they can converse about them, but when you ask them to write about them, for whatever reason, it doesn't. And that's why you need to be explicit in taking that excitement and that passion, that explosion of ideas and content, or whatever it is, that immersive learning, cognition, and critical thinking, back to a written outcome, and not end the teaching process there. It's not enough to read a text and talk about it and say, kids, go home and write about it. You can get by with 5% of the state of the kids doing that, but most of them, myself included, are going to need some pretty guided, explicit instruction on how you write about those ideas appropriately, using the appropriate register. So that's where we go back into the great thing about the bubble, and the scaffold around this does that, is it allows you to engage in that process of Q&A to elicit that, and it gives them a really clear, clean format that allows them to express those complex ideas with confidence. And explicit teaching recognises the importance of guiding students towards a relevant response that's relevant to their HSC. Because, as I said before, their HSC is a written response. It's not cutting up a heart or feeling deeply. It's a written response. And the bubble allows these students to synthesise that. So as you can see there, let's write about it. That's where you have to go with all of your key content. Take it back to the board and write about it with the students. So here what we've done is we've stuck the textual representation in the middle, put a circle around it, talked about it as a metaphor. That's terrific. And then we use those verb stems to have a conversation with the students to say, okay, we were just talking about we just had 3 synonyms for healing. What were they? 2 with R, 1 with C. What were those words? And you elicit that, you get the kids to spell it. It's allowing them to engage in a process of cognitive recall. And you build those sentences on the board and talk about why it's possibly in their better interest to write all 3 of those rather than 1, depending on your preferences as a classroom teacher. You might have talked about romantic pantheism, so you can talk about how it evokes that. You can talk about how there is an inference there that what is the message is it saying about a divinity? There's this all-encompassing one, whatever the case may be. And as it says down there, there is a message. Shelley, as a romantic novelist, she wrote this there was a very clear message about a return to nature in response to the Enlightenment, and the texts do direct us to what concept. And you can introduce that word ineffability as an ultimate source of, and you can elicit those. You probably elicited those words like inspiration, guidance, and wonder in in your discussion. So you draw it back. retrieve those words from the students, and you show them how to compose a response. And look, using the gradual release of responsibility model as required, you can be very explicit there. You can say, okay, guys, it's Shelley's use of metaphor describing the glorious presence of nature and that gave wings to the soul, evokes this, replicating this, suggesting this, and directing us thus. That's probably a bit long. You might say, stick a sentence in full stop in the middle of it. So it's the use of metaphor celebrating the tranquilizing of the wings of the soul, whatever the case may be, evokes this, comma, a full stop. This replicates romantic pantheism, suggesting da-da-da and directing us towards, well, you might stick the participle on the front and say, suggesting nature is part of an all-encompassing divinity, Shelley's metaphorical representation of the glorious presence chamber of nature that gave wings to the soul evokes this, replicating this and directing this. But what they do is they walk away with a little block of inappropriate register with the appropriate meta language and terminology, a little takeaway that they can slide into a paragraph. And you can do that over the course of a unit of work a number of times. And then go through the process if you need to, and I'll jump ahead 2 slides, and saying, okay, remember that bit of work, that's, maybe you want to slide in here. If you talk to them, you can talk to them about paragraphing. You can say, this is, you need to have your topic sentence. You need to introduce the bits of rep. Because, if you've done HSC marking, or if you hadn't, textual representation is 75% of that paragraph. It's all about writing, about language. So, these are these little chunks that they can slide in. Or they can change, or they can adapt, whatever the case may be, the requirements of an assessment task. But you've got the foundation there to what they need to be writing about. The other part of that, we'll go back to this very briefly, excuse the minimalised window there, is the thing about the process is it's the best of both worlds. Explicit teaching sounds dry, but it's not. Because you have that moment where you have that ideas, concept, engagement, passion. You bring in personal anecdotes. You have them all laughing, crying, feeling, whatever, understanding. But then you take it back to an explicit scaffold, and then you end up with a quality written outcome. And the assessment in the HSC is about a quality written outcome. And so you're able to have both of these moments. And I would actually say, yeah, look, I used to love that discussion. I still do love that discussion. But I gain a lot more pleasure and joy and satisfaction out of seeing the students being able to put those concepts, or synthesize those concepts into a written form, and to be able to write about them, knowing that they are going into an HSC with an understanding of how to write. And that confidence building process is hugely important. So anyway, there it is. Unleash, enjoy, lots of fun. Apologies, this was the second cut, so look, the jury will always be out. Thanks very much.